Welcome to the 21st century. Home consoles have finally surpassed what arcade machines can do, leaving those big, beautiful, but ultimately bulky and power-hungry machines by the wayside. The arcades as we know them are dead.
But even without a dedicated building to house the physical tables, pinball lives on. In the late 80s and 90s, we watched as video pinball transformed from simple playthings to proper simulations. But think back to part 2. I mentioned that something was missing. You see, there's an unwritten law in gaming that I've mentioned a few times on this channel. Everything had to be 3D in the 90s. And yet, pinball managed to dodge that bullet entirely. Every single game we've looked at has been presented in 2 dimensions, pre-rendered graphics aside. And this continued well into the 2000s.
That's not to say 3D didn't sneak its way in anyway, of course. Some games had elements of 3D, even if the majority of the graphics were in 2D.
Take True Pinball for instance, an enhanced re-release of Pinball Illusions for the PlayStation. It uses pre-rendered graphics as we're used to, but the flippers and ball are proper 3D objects. So why did pinball avoid going 3D? You'd think it'd be a no-brainer. Well, in a 2012 interview with Pinside, pro pinball developer Adrian Barrett explains that using pre-rendered visuals frees up the CPU to spend virtually all its time on the simulation. That interview pertains to the 2014 remake of Time Shock, but it's likely that applied to the original pro pinball tables as well. It's also reasonable to assume that the 3D capabilities of systems at the time just weren't ready for pinball.
As evidenced by 1999's Pinball, which I believe to be the first fully 3D pinball video game. We've had dealings with eGames in the past, so I'm not holding out much hope.
Start the game and... okay guys, we get it, it's 3D. Rayman was doing this stuff 4 years ago, you're not impressing anybody. This extremely counterintuitive menu gives a choice of 3 different tables: Jungle Warrior, Curse of the Pharaoh, and Viking's Life.
The excitement is palpable, let me tell you.
All 3 are nothing more than totally average tables, and I would have overlooked them entirely had this game not been 3D. In fact, they're so bare bones that they're almost indistinguishable from each other. Even the physics fail to be interesting. They're serviceable and nothing more. One thing I did notice was that the ball bounced upwards an awful lot. That doesn't normally happen that much in real pins, and especially not in video pinball. So while it does prove that they've got a Z-axis in the physics engine, it also speaks to the quality of the table design, or lack thereof. You also get 5 camera angles, which can be switched between on the fly. This wasn't exactly new as such. Slam Tilt allowed you to switch between low and high res mode while playing, and the pro pinball games have multiple different views to pick from. The camera angles in this pinball, however, well, they're great if you normally play your pinball through a telescope. So it's yet another middle of the road video pin. It just happens to be the first one to make the transition to polygons. Sure you want to exit? You're damn right, I'm sure.
I suppose we had to start somewhere with 3D pinball, but it didn't really become the norm for a while after this. Not until we got these things anyway.
The PlayStation 2 was home to several different pin games, and the flexibility of having full 3D environments meant developers could get a lot more creative. They could introduce some more of that fantasy element, the things that wouldn't be possible on a real table. We've seen this sort of thing already, even going back to the really early days, but some developers took it to the extreme, as is the case with Flipnic.
The heck am I playing?
Drop of silver approaches the stage.
Okay, let's try and make some sense of this. I think the best comparison we can make is that it's like Sonic Spinball, but with elements of 3D Ultra thrown in for good measure, but it makes less sense than either of them. The main table has a few bumpers and that's about it. Sometimes there's a slot machine at the back, but other times there isn't. You can ship your ball off to different mini tables as well. While it's rolling along the habit rail, you can make it jump to collect coins. What the coins do is a mystery to me. Each mini table has different stuff on it, but it's mostly just more bumpers. One of the tables has a few ramps you can hit, and a UFO? Oh yeah, that's a big one. In regular pinball, it can be hard to tell how or why certain things happen. Like in Big Race USA, it's not initially clear how to activate the various modes, but at least you have a chance of working that one out. This, well, I have no idea why what happens happens. It just does.
Oh my god.
Warning? Why? Freeze over?
Freeze over.
Oh, whoops. You know, for all its weirdness, this table's actually a decent amount of fun. It's nice to try and find all the features of the table, and the animations and table decorations make it an impressive sight to behold. However, I found that after a while, it felt like I was going around in circles. I got fed up of watching the ball glide around the habit rails, and it all started to become a bit tedious. It seems odd to talk about ball physics in a game such as this, but they do need addressing. They're floaty. And of all the games to have dodgy physics, this is the one where you need a lot of precision to hit some of these trickier targets. As exciting as this table is though, we have 3 more to look at. They're all totally unique, which is a first, although that's not to say they're all good. Metallurgy is the next table, and my goodness, if the biology table felt like going round in circles, this one feels like you're on the teacups at Lightwater Valley. I seemed to spend most of my time trying to escape these magnets, but once I did there was nothing else to see. I'm afraid I just couldn't work this one out, and it wasn't terribly enjoyable. Optics is next. I feel like these tables are getting less and less interesting as we go on, which is a shame because I like the aesthetic of this one, but the objectives require a level of precision that the physics just don't offer, and otherwise it's just bumpers. Finally we have geometry, and I'm sorry, I didn't realise we were playing Bombay all of a sudden. Geometry takes the form of a breakout style game with the paddlers controlled with the left analog stick. And it's absolute control, as in the paddle mirrors the movement of your stick. This one's hardly pinball and you hardly have any control over it. Somehow the physics are even worse this time around, and I couldn't take much more than 5 minutes of it.
I feel like the takeaway from the designing of this type of game is really just that, like, nothing is ever as obvious as it seems once you've played something and you're like, oh yeah, that's how it works and how it should have worked the whole time and how it needed to work. When you're iterating on it, you're just kind of like blind and you're like, we could go 1,000 directions with this. Each of them is possibly a good idea, you know? And just like really trying stuff out and messing with it and responding to it and iterating with it is really kind of what leads you to a lot of things. So it's such an interesting, it's an interesting space to try to like mess with and design something that's just kind of raw and physical like that.
So far this generation's not doing much for me. Could I have at least one game that shows that the 2000s aren't a gigantic waste of time?
Well, maybe we can. You see, at this stage of proceedings, you've got a lot of veteran gamers who were around when pinball was at its height in the arcades. And there's now a demand for those experiences in a more portable format, shall we say. We saw the same with retro arcade compilations, which became a much bigger market during the PS2 era. A little studio called Farsight saw the potential of this niche yet totally untapped audience, and in 2004 gave us Pinball Hall of Fame, the Gottlieb collection. Here's something that retro compilations of this vintage tended to do. The virtual arcade. Namco Museum famously kicked off the trend, and you also got it with Space Invaders Anniversary and, to a certain extent, with the much later Sega Mega Drive collection. Pinball Hall of Fame does the same sort of thing. Each of the 7 tables on offer can be selected by wandering through the arcade, complete with a bit of ambient noise. It's meant to make you feel as if you're really there, and I guess with a good pair of headphones it's probably quite effective. If you listen closely it sounds like Defender and maybe Golf? Otherwise, what you get is a set of pin games from Gottlieb, one of the leading manufacturers during the golden age of pinball, recreated in glorious 3D. Gottlieb's tables always felt a bit dated to me, even the newer ones, but that's not the fault of this collection. There's some good attention paid to the details in each table, with all the artwork recreated such that they're just as clear as their real life counterparts, at least as clear as a 480i image can be. I particularly like that they've included Black Hole, which has an upside down section. They didn't have to do that, but it shows a certain level of commitment which I really do like. Something else that shows that they know their stuff, each table has a full explanation of the rules.
Central Park is simple in its goals. but it's difficult to keep the ball alive. These instructions will explain what you need to do. Mastering the nudge is the key to success.
Plus a high-res scan, again 480i, of the advertisement flyer. As with the other 3D pinball game we played, there are a wide selection of camera angles to pick from here. Some of them are like you have your face pressed up against the glass. The default angle moves dynamically based on where the ball is. If it's near the flippers, you'll see the entire table. This is a good idea on paper, but in practice it's better to zoom out and have the full thing in view at all times, unless you like losing your ball. However, there's a major flaw with the Gottlieb collection. Realistic physics do not live here, unless you habitually play your pinball underwater. I have to wonder if this was done to make it more accessible, as it's easier to keep your ball in play. But it's really obvious that this isn't how pinball should feel. It's a major step backwards, worse even than Alien Crush. Another issue I found was that, while you do have the ability to nudge, the tables are super sensitive to it. If you so much as touch the nudge controls, the table will immediately tilt. And what's this? Balls going through flippers? Thought we'd left that one in the 90s. If you manage to set enough high scores and complete the goals included with each table, you might unlock some extra stuff. There's an 8th table to be found called Playboy, which was made in 1932 and, well, it shows. There's also a love tester, about as useful as the real-life love testers, and one of those creepy fortune tellers.
Please give Zoltan a moment to confer with the stars and examine your soul. Be yourself. Deceit does not become you.
4 years later,
4 flipping years!
Farsight followed up with a collection of pins from Williams. From an entirely personal and subjective standpoint, this game has a much stronger set of tables. Again, you're given 8 games from various years between 1979 to 88.
This is a significantly smaller range than Gottlieb's 1932 to 89, but that's only because Williams hadn't been around as long.
Whether you prefer one manufacturer to the other though, doesn't change that the physics have vastly improved this time round. The ball feels like a real ball moving through real air, although I reckon the table's been tilted back a few degrees, once again for that all-important accessibility. It's a shame this can't be modified. Evidently that sort of control is reserved for games with Pro in the title. Each table has also been given a handful of extra goals, for example opening Pinbot's visor or spelling out Gorga. But these are just for bragging rights this time. As far as I can tell, there were no extra bits beyond the 8 tables. I know they were all just daft playthings in the previous game, but it's still nice to have some sort of reward for your effort. Maybe they could have included 1 or 2 Williams arcade games as unlockable features.
I'd buy that for $1.
The ball still goes through the flippers, by the way. If you're thinking of picking this one up, look for the version released for 7th gen consoles. The Xbox 360 and PS3 versions include 5 extra tables over what the PS2 offers, which happen to be the best of the lot. There are also versions for Wii and 3DS, each with only 2 extra tables, and both collections were ported to the PSP as well, which amazingly can be played in portrait. Being a budget game from 2008, it's a surprise they even put it on the PS2. The culmination of Farsight's pinball collections came in 2012 in the form of the Pinball Arcade. For a long time this was the definitive official way to play pinball on a variety of systems. From iPad to Xbox One, Wii U to Vita, Pinball Arcade is a well-travelled game. It even came out on the Ouya. Gameplay wise it's pretty darn similar to the Williams collection, but a bit more polished and refined. Not much more to say on that front. The camera angles are all the same and the attention to detail is as present as ever. I found it a bit of a struggle to keep the ball in place sometimes, but that may be due to the camera angles. One of the Pinball Arcade's strengths was in the vastness of its library. At its peak a couple of years ago, there were a total of 98 tables available for the platform, most of which were licensed from Williams and Bally, and they had some big properties at the time. One of the major draws was the Twilight Zone, a table whose license was funded by a wildly successful Kickstarter campaign.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination.
One that also brought us Star Trek The Next Generation. Once again we see that Farsight really did care about the product, and about the preservation of pinball history, which makes the fate of the Pinball Arcade even more of a kick in the balls. The pinballs, that is. In May 2018, Farsight lost the license to Williams and Bally tables. Not only did this mean they lost the Twilight Zone, a table they'd worked so hard to get, they ended up losing a total of 61 games overall, leaving them with, at the time, just 37. That's a bunch of Gottlieb tables, a few from previously unseen manufacturer Stern, plus this dreadful Doctor Who table, which is about as much fun as Kiss Pinball, and about as relevant too. In its defence, the Pinball Arcade also still includes the unreleased table Going Nuts, which is unique in that every ball is a multi-ball, but that's kind of all it has going for it. So there you have it, the tragedy of the Pinball Arcade. And as of this video, it's still the only official way to play Star Trek The Next Generation digitally, assuming you already own the table, that is. While all this was going on, there was a bit of activity on the handhelds, specifically Nintendo's latest system, the Game Boy Advance.
Thinking about it, the GBA is an ideal system for a bit of portable pinball action, so long as you're in a well-lit area, such as the surface of the sun.
Okay, we know Mario's a bloke of many talents. Plumber, golfer, tennis player, explosive ordnance disposal, aeroplane. But pinball?
Bit of a stretch. Or a squash. Whatever.
I don't know why they even bothered with the opening cutscene on this one. Mario games always have the same plot, but this one somehow seems a bit rushed. Princess Toadstool gets turned into a ball and captured by Bowser, and that's about the size of it. Now, to my mind, it'd probably be a lot easier for Mario to rescue her on foot. That's worked for him countless times before and since. But being the smart man he is, he decided he's going to become a ball himself instead. The game itself is a set of pinball vignettes. That's the best way I can describe it. You don't get one big table, you don't get 4 reasonably sized tables. You get a whole boatload of teeny tiny tables, each one fitting on a single GBA screen. Not the worst idea I've ever heard. And once again, this harkens back to our old friend 3D Ultra Pinball. Each level has a specific objective you need to complete. Most of the time it's defeat all the enemies, but sometimes it's a little more specific. Completing the objective will net you a Power Star. Essentially, this is Super Mario 64 in pinball form, even down to the choice of enemies. This wouldn't be half bad, but the problem lies in the table design. Because they lack the usual obstacles, for want of a better word, there's not really much to break Mario's momentum. Couple that with the fact that certain tables have curved edges, and the ball becomes extremely difficult to keep under control. Most of the time you're just trying to catch the darn thing. You can't hold neutral this time. All this is quite surprising, really. From this you'd think the developers perhaps hadn't spent much time with pinball. But get this, Super Mario Ball was made by a little studio called Fuse Games, previously known as Cunning Developments, who made Pro Pinball.
The heck were they playing at?
They are sort of building a foundation with pinball nostalgia and simulation, and then they are building from there and expanding it, and I think that's super cool. When we started working on this thing, we obviously took a look at the stuff out there, and we looked back at some of the GBA stuff, like there's some Crocodile pinball game on the GBA, I think, that we had lots of fun with, because they did more than just a pinball table. And a bunch of other stuff, but there wasn't really anything where they built a world around pinball, so that was sort of the challenge.
Mario couldn't have all the fun though. It was about time Sonic stepped back into the video pin game scene.
After his disastrous first attempt at being a pinball, Sonic Pinball Party was the result, and rather than batting Sonic himself around, we're treated to a selection of tables based on various Sega properties. This game's more reminiscent of the Amiga and DOS pinball games. We're back to 2D scrollers again, basically. There's a story mode included, but that's only a means to an end. And that end is to unlock the third table? Yeah. The 3 tables you get are based on Sonic, Knights, and Samba de Amigo. The latter is the worst of the 3 because it's all just loops. Big Race USA did it better, trust me. The other 2 are really nothing special. It even tricks you into thinking there's more tables than there actually are. It's a real missed opportunity. Think of all the Sega properties that could have worked really well with pinball. Outrun, Crazy Taxi, Super Monkey Ball, or, wait for it, just think of the possibilities. Basically what I'm asking for is AM2 to make a pinball game. I suppose this one's alright if you just want a quick pinball hit on the go, and at the time it was one of the better choices out there. But it wouldn't keep its lustre for very long because, as we're all aware, Nintendo weren't content with just one screen. When the DS came along, it brought with it a lot of potential.
Where you two see problems, I see opportunity.
And while some developers didn't really know what to do with these two vertical screens, others ran with the concept. And you know what a vertical set of screens is ideal for?
Bit of pinball. Fuse Games and Nintendo were back once again to pioneer this idea, and they picked a more sensible theme this time.
Rather than putting Mario through a horrendous body horror situation, they instead used the Metroid games as inspiration. You know, the game where the main character turns into a ball fairly frequently. This here is Metroid Prime Pinball. From the get-go, the table design is much more traditional, which intrinsically means you have a lot more control over the ball and what you're doing with it. Not only that, but the vertical playfield really is a game changer. The game's presented in an overhead view, which means you have visibility over the whole thing. And as we've discussed at length, that's something you can't easily do on a landscape display. This is also crucial to the handheld experience, since everything's so teeny tiny, and you really don't want to lose sight of your ball. Something else I'd like to draw attention to are the physics. They're great! I'm not saying that they're ultra realistic, because this isn't a hardcore simulation, but they still feel natural, and you have total control over where you're flinging sammers across the table. You can really tell this is a pro pinball job. To help with the accessibility, each table also starts you off with a ball saver. There is a bit of a problem with having two screens though. This is an early DS game, and was made when there was about a 3-mile gap in between the screens. As such, when Samus passes between them, she disappears from view, and this can sometimes mess you up if you're not on the ball. Of course, since this isn't supposed to be a simulation, there's a lot of fun fantasy stuff going on here. Sometimes you'll have creatures roaming around the table that you have to squash, and there are a few bosses to fight. They're a bit of a pain in the balls, since despite the size they require some very precise shots. But it's nice to see nonetheless, and it's a much better implementation than Mario's attempt. In addition to your classic pinball gameplay, there are also these more gamey bits thrown in for good measure. I don't really have a problem with them. They break up the action a bit and, again, accommodate for players who are perhaps playing it for the Metroid Prime elements, rather than the pinball. The wall jumping's a bit tricky though. Even Mario 64's wall jumping was less picky than this. Saying that, I do have to wonder who this is for. I mean, I like it. As someone who enjoys both Metroid Prime and pinball games, this is a great little game, but I can't imagine that's a particularly large market, honestly. Anyway, point is, this is a brilliant package for some portable pin gaming. And you know what else? It supports the Rumble Pack, one of only 51 games for the DS that do so. That's 2 for 2 so far. Before I forget, I feel it's worth giving an honourable mention to Peggle, released by PopCap Games in 2007. Peggle plays a lot like the old pinball games, such as Bagatelle and Baffle Ball. The goal is to fire your silver ball and hit as many pegs as you can before it reaches the bottom. Take out all the orange pegs and you win! It introduces some later pinball aspects such as multi-ball, flippers, and that's about it. I guess the bucket counts as a ball saver and a hurry-up award, but otherwise it's not got much in common with your average video pinball game. What it does have is that signature PopCap playfulness, and that's something which I'll always recommend.
The way I approach design is like always sort of looking at what's working in an abstract for like play, and it could be 52 deck card games or board games or stickball or like, you know, anything, like any version of play that exists, and like try to recreate it in a video game. And I feel like that was what was happening a lot in gaming in the 80s and 90s, where it was still a pretty infant medium, and it was like, well, what other types of play have we not digitized? And I feel like if I was going to take a guess, that would be my guess, that like trying to tackle the physics and the fun of a physical thing like pinball, like a pinball table in a digital space would be an interesting challenge. Gaming's modern thrust like hadn't really happened yet, or maybe was just happening. So I feel like we were maybe still looking backwards to like what do we already play that we can make into a video game.
Farsight were on top of the video pinball world with the Pinball Arcade. But that's not to say they didn't have the competitors.
2007 saw a 3D pinball game exclusively for the brand new PlayStation 3 and the slightly less new Xbox 360, and one that went in the complete opposite direction to the Pinball Hall of Fame series. Its name was Pinball FX.
Or Zen Pinball, depending on your platform of choice, and it prided itself on having fully original tables. In 2010 it was followed up by Pinball Fx2, which for most of its lifetime coexisted with the Pinball Arcade. Pinball Fx2 had fewer tables and much less realistic physics than the Pinball Arcade, but the strength of its original tables, plus the various properties Zen Studios had managed to pick up a license for, made people turn their heads. And in 2017, its most recent iteration came along in the form of, you guessed it, Pro 3D Ultra Full Tilt Illusions. No, wait, Pinball FX3. All the tables from the previous games carried over to the third, making this the definitive Zen Studios pinball experience. FX contains a huge variety of original tables, some based on existing IP and others that are totally new to this game. The themes of the tables do appear to have been inspired somewhat, but they play alright to me, and you can tell there's been some effort in making them feel like the real life counterparts. The physics work well too, they're a little softer than what you'd expect out of a real table, but I can see the case for this. It's a good way of introducing new players with some easier to handle physics. A few of them did feel a bit samey, but there's a decent amount of variety here. On top of this, there are a wide selection of tables based on existing franchises. Ever felt like there wasn't enough Star Wars pinball in your life? Well, look no further. Marvel, Alien, Jurassic Park, Universal, even The Walking Dead are all represented within FX3 tables. Some of them are good, but most of them are okay, and I'm not convinced there need to be so many of them. I can understand having one for Jurassic Park and another for Jurassic World, but to have so many Marvel tables, at least 2 of which are based on Captain America? By a similar token, of the video game related tables, Doom is far and away the strongest of the lot, with a variety of modes and unlockables to play with. On the flip side, the Portal table, one you'd think would be a slam dunk for a pinball game, is a bit of a washout. Honestly, there are so many tables here that it's difficult to talk about which ones are better than others, and not all of them are particularly appealing to me either. I mean, why would I play Sorcerer's Lair or Epic Quest when I can play Circus Voltaire in Medieval Madness? Yes indeed, after Farsight lost the license to Williams Properties, it was promptly handed over to Zen Studios.
That must have been difficult to watch.
Anyway, we have a great selection of tables here, all lovingly rendered as before. There isn't a whole lot to add, except that the physics are a marked improvement and feel very realistic. One thing though, that might not be very clear from watching, this table's been tilted forward. It's a common thing with pinball tables that you can adjust their angle, fundamentally altering how it plays. As a general rule, tilting it forward will make the ball fall faster and make it harder to hit ramps.
Because that's kind of how gravity works, you know.
To have these tables tilted forward kind of goes against what I was saying before. These games are even less accessible. It's a shame there aren't any options to customise this, because it'd make for a much more complete package if it did. Especially since FX2 had this exact feature. It seems totally bonkers to me to remove such a thing, particularly when you have real life tables in the mix. You get to change the graphics though.
Big deal.
I prefer to keep this turned off, but I'm sure there's a market for this stuff somewhere. All that aside, this is a great way to play some classic tables. And if you want to indulge in the original stuff too, then it's all there for the taking.
So, we come to the present day.
Video pinball's in a great place. We have some impressive original efforts alongside high quality recreations of physical tables. But it's all kinda looked the same, hasn't it? Every pinball game has a table, flippers and a ball. They have bumpers, ramps, kickouts, habit rails, and whatever other pinball elements you can think of. Sometimes there are dinosaurs on a playfield, sometimes there are giant rock monsters, and sometimes you're avoiding debris in a jeep. And the ball is almost always silver. What if it didn't have to be that way? Remember last time when I looked at Sonic Spinball? I mentioned that there were ways and means of doing a pinball platformer, and it turns out the ways and means are right here. This is Yoku's Island Express, developed by Villa Gorilla.
Yoku's Island Express, it's a pinball platformer Metroidvania. You take the role of Dung Beetle, a postman coming to this exotic island of Mokumana to take the job as the postman. And Since he's a dung beetle, he travels on his big ball. It's a 2D side-scrolling game, and you traverse by pushing the ball left and right, as well as use flippers spread throughout the island. So there's no jump button, but there's tons of flippers instead.
Yoku is directly controlled by the player, but to really get around the environment, you have to make use of the various flippers dotted around. He's only a wee bug, you know, he can't jump. So it's got a little bit of that Spinball DNA, but unlike that game, it's a lot more interesting to play. The pinball sections have a great flow about them and present their own objectives within a self-contained area. To progress, you really do need to master your use of the flippers, and while you do have a bit of control over Yoku while he's airborne, there's no nudging here at all.
I think we missed Sonic Spinball in our research phase, so no one on the team really knew it, and then we announced the game and everyone was referring to, oh, it's like Sonic Spinball, and we had to look it up. A lot of people referenced that game, and there's Rollers of the Realm on PC, that's more of an RPG merged with pinball. But yeah, a couple of games have tried doing that, but execution has been okay, I guess.
To progress, you need to complete objectives around the island, which mostly amounts to doing favours for people. Doing so unlocks more areas of the island to explore. It's a classic Metroidvania, but the structure isn't too dissimilar to that of a 3D platformer, especially given the large open environment. One thing I particularly enjoy is the extent to which pinball elements are used. They serve a major part in playing the game, but they're not overwhelming at all, and the game doesn't get bogged down in the pinball aspect. It's a good balance, and makes for a unique and enjoyable experience. This also means the physics don't have to be spot on, but despite this, they feel natural and like you have enough control over Yoku. Or indeed, Yoku's big stone ball.
I actually don't think they are too realistic. We did tons of stuff that's not realistic with the physics. Initially, I just plugged in like a basic physics engine and then tuned sort of the behaviors, the strengths of the different, like the flippers and stuff like that to my liking. Like I looked at pinball tables and how they behave. Like take something, for example, how the ball bounces off the flipper. In a modern flipper table, it's super bouncy. Like it bounces back and forth between the two sides of, or like left and right side of the pinball table. That didn't really work well. So if you do that in Yoku, it almost like stops when it hits the flipper. And physics-wise, that's realistic, but it's not necessarily how most pinball tables work. But it's all about like the feel, and we had to take into account that we didn't have a like portrait-style table, the playing area. Like people are playing video games on widescreens mostly, and that had a huge influence on how we could design levels, especially since we were a straight-up 2D kind of game with no depth. So every pinball level and stuff were designed more for a widescreen format, which changed a lot of stuff.
And that's to say nothing of the graphics. We're back to 2D, and what an aesthetic. It's like a storybook. Some of the animations are a bit odd, since all the characters are puppets, but that kind of adds to the charm. It's like you're playing a cartoon. Bet it'd look even better in glorious 240p.
But pinball's flirt with other genres wasn't over just yet.
Flight School's premier pinball with swords game, Creature in the Well, released just last year, chucked a few new ideas into the mix, making for another unique pinball experience.
Creature in the Well is a top-down hack-and-slash adventure game, but instead of like traditional combat, swords fighting monsters and enemies of that type, you are in a giant, ancient pinball machine. And every room that you go through is like a tiny circuit board of pinball, bouncy, breakout mechanics with a third-person controller. So you play as a robot named Botsy, who is the last of an engineering collective whose job it was to make this machine hundreds and maybe thousands of years ago. And you run into the creature in the darkness, which is like a pair of eyes and skeletal hands who's set on stopping you to complete your work.
Like Yoku's Island Express, Creature takes those familiar pinball aspects and runs with them. Instead of hitting the ball and hoping, this time you have much more direct control over what you're doing with it. You still have to rely on physics to help you out, of course. Without that bit, it wouldn't really be a pinball game. Another thing that's unique about Creature, and something you've likely spotted already, where are the flippers? Well, this is a hack and slash, and as such your main method of attack is to belt the ball with your sword, or kitchen utensil. Flight School were clearly ahead of the curve in this regard, since the ball can't go through the flippers if there aren't any flippers. This might sound like it makes the game too easy, but far from it. It can get pretty frantic with balls flying around at the speed of sound. Better hope none of them are on fire, or it's game over.
We really wanted to create a setup where like you as a player are trying to master control over an external object, the ball that you're bouncing around, or in this case like tons of balls, because we have this multi-ball setup of like you can have a lot of them moving around at one time. There's such like good juice and feedback to pinball machines, and we wanted to capture that and also have a design language that made it clear like what should and shouldn't be hit with a ball, and just like have things bounce around a lot.
The aesthetic is gorgeous as well. It looks like a particularly gnarly graphic novel, the sort you might see in 2000 AD, although perhaps not as gritty. Man, when did 3D games start looking so good? Admittedly, this one kind of teeters on the edge of being a pinball game, but I think there's enough of the elements present to include it within this vast pantheon. And if nothing else, it shows just what can be done by thinking outside the box. The back box, that is. Okay, that was a bit of a stretch.
And that is the history of pinball video games. But before we finish, I'd like to give some time to a piece of software that's been a huge part of virtual pin gaming for decades.
May I introduce Visual Pinball?
I am the king of pain. My men will destroy you.
Visual Pinball isn't a game in and of itself. It's a piece of software made for creating and playing virtual pin games. It's got a pretty big community behind it too, meaning there's a massive variety of tables available for the platform. These are from real pinball fans, and if there's one thing you should know about pinball fans, they tend to know their onions. Most of the tables you'll find have been reproduced to meticulous detail. Part of the reason for that is the communal effort that goes into each one. Owners of the real tables contribute scans and photos. You have programmers making scripts for the tables, and of course the people who build the table designs themselves, plus those crazy people who do all three. Then later on, someone else will come along and improve that design. In a sense, it's a bit like Mugen for pinball. From electromechanical games to modern-ish solid-state machines, games you've never heard of to all-time classics, and even a few original efforts, there's something for everyone here. A lot of these even rival the likes of FX3 and the Pinball Arcade. One thing I really do appreciate about Visual Pinball is that it's a fantastic way to experience pinball history firsthand. You can see where the game started, where it ended up, and everything in between. For example, did you know that there was a table based on the arcade game Defender? In fact, the two games coexisted, since at the time, Williams was a pinball manufacturer first, while video games played second fiddle. That's a story for another day though. Sometimes you'll find the tables aren't quite on model. For example, the lighting on this version of Medieval Madness is a bit extreme. The physics can also vary between tables, but if you stick to top rated stuff, you can't really go wrong. Something I'm not so fond of are these backgrounds. Call me old fashioned, but I personally prefer it when it's just the table. The first release of Visual Pinball came in 2000, meaning it was one of the earlier 3D pinball efforts, and one of the few viable options for PC. While I haven't seen this first version in action, I think it's safe to assume it was better than eGames' shoddy workmanship. From what I can gather, its primary purpose is to be used on virtual cabinets. You know, like having a MAME cabinet for playing arcade games, but with pinball tables instead. Over the years it's been borrowed by various manufacturers for use in real hardware. For example, in 2005 it was included in a project called UltraPin, a pre-built virtual cabinet, with the modifications released back to the community. In 2008, the same thing happened when it was licensed for use with the Pinball Wizard controller for PC. If I had the room for a cabinet, I could speak more to its effectiveness, but there are lots of resources out there for the budding pinball fanatic. All I'll say is, this is a wonderful way to experience some quality pin gaming at home.
It's interesting to look back at pinball video games, because they're indicative of the level of technology available at the time. Each generation, developers were pushing to make better physics, more realistic tables and do more interesting things within the confines of what is ostensibly a very simple game.
We went from 8 to 16-bit, and pinball was there. When CDs came along, speech and pre-rendered graphics became the standard. It took a little time for pinball to adopt 3D, but it did, and look where we are now. And from the very beginning, there's always been a pinball game to play.
In fact, there are just such a staggering amount of pinball video games that I couldn't possibly hope to cover them in a lifetime, let alone a single video.
Pokemon Pinball, Tilt, Pinball Pulse, Macadam Bumper. There's the Little Wing games keeping the Mac crowd busy, Zaccaria Pinball for PC, focusing on the Italian manufacturer, and about 1,000,001 games for the British home micros.
In fact, the only system I can think of without a pinball game is the N64.
It's amazing how this genre of games has always been there in the undercurrent. How there's always been an interest in pinball, even long after it had left its peak of popularity. And from what I can see, it's not going anywhere fast. There's never been a better time to be a pinball fan.
That's tough to say. I feel like people are always going to have an interest in just like simple physics games. You know, it's like there's something so clean and nice about a ball game. Like we talked about that when we started Creature. It's just kind of like any game that involves a ball, soccer, basketball, whatever. It just has this natural flow and tension of like when you make a shot or the ball is traveling, there's the moment of suspense where you're like, is it going to go in there? Is it going to miss? Is it going to whatever? So there's this like inherent framework to ball physics games that I feel like is really appealing. And I feel like pinball's in that range, you know? So I can't say if it's going to like surge as much as it had before, but like I feel like it's around.
I'd like to quickly thank the people whose voices you've heard throughout this video. Jens Andersson, developer of Yoku's Island Express, and Adam Volker and Bohdon Sayre, developers of Creature in the Well. The full interviews with them will be published in the coming weeks. Hopefully you'll find them interesting. I certainly did. And a big thanks to all of you for watching and enjoying this series. If you're a newly converted pinball fan, I recommend paying a visit to Arcade Club in Bury, where they have a nice selection of tables for you to try. There's also the Dutch Pinball Museum in Rotterdam, which I haven't visited, but it looks amazing. If you have any other recommendations, feel free to post them in the comments. Long live pinball.
Right, that's that out of the way. I'm amazed I managed to go through this whole series without making a Who joke. I can't explain, damn it!